It is so nice to be with you here this evening. I've visited several times. You've been so friendly and so welcoming to myself and my wife, Jeanette. Jeanette's not feeling well, so she's at home this evening. But you've been so welcoming and have just really made me feel very comfortable here. And Jay and Doug, boy, talk about some nice guys. They even took me out to lunch. Jay did keep the toy that came in the kids' meal, but they paid for lunch, and so that was nice. I have to admit, though, it does bother me a little bit. You know, they both invited me to come and speak, and then they both left town, and so you guys are stuck with me. I am the president at East Texas Christian Academy, and we're still trying to get moved in and unload the boxes and all, but please don't be too impressed with that. I remember hearing the story about a little boy that started kindergarten, and you know how children are. They just, and every day, this little boy would come home from kindergarten, he'd sit his preschool-age sister down at the desk, and he would teach her the lessons that he learned that day. And so this has been going on for several days, and finally, one day during the after-school class with his preschool sister, she raised her hand, and she said, why can't I be the teacher? So he put his hands on his hip, gave the best stern teacher look that he could come up with, and he said, you don't know enough to be the teacher. To which she responded, well, at least I can be an administrator. I do want to acknowledge that one of our board members, John Carpenter, is here with us this evening. John attends over at Shiloh Road, but John used to be a member here, and I'm glad to have John with us. And also Robert Thornton. Robert works with us part-time in public relations. He does a fabulous job with us, and does have a display out in the lobby. If you have any questions, he can talk with you about that. And so just real excited, though. A lot of neat things are happening at ETCA. We just finished our first football season. We inaugurated six-man football, and we ended up with a perfect season. We didn't win a game, but it was a marvelous experience. We had our first football homecoming yesterday, and so there's just a lot of neat, exciting things happening at ETCA. And this evening, I want to talk with you about likeness education. That Christian education, whether it's in the home, the church, or at a school like ETCA, Christian education is about likeness education, becoming like Jesus, and that's done through a process of replication. And some of what I'm going to be saying this evening, if you were in Sunday school, this is going to be a repeat of some of the things you heard in Sunday school. Somebody once told me that great minds think alike, so there must be at least two of us with great minds here. And so there's going to be a repeat of some of what was said in the auditorium class this morning. This evening, I want to begin by going to the cross. Then one of the criminals who was hanged blasphemed him, saying, if you're the Christ, save yourself and us. But the other answering rebuked him, saying, do you not even fear God, seeing that you are under the same condemnation, and we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And then he said to Jesus, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, assuredly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. The thief on the cross. In many ways, what a comforting story that in the midst of dying for the sins of the world, Jesus still has the compassion to look at one sinner who's reaching out for hope. But this passage bothers me a great deal. It's a passage that makes me step back and to think about some things that I really don't want to think about. Luke calls them criminals. The word that Luke uses is the word malefactor. It's the word for something bad with the word for worker. And it's literally the word that's used for something that's rotten. And so these guys are rotten guys. They're rotten people. They go around doing bad stuff. Now, when Matthew and Mark talk about the thieves that were crucified on either side of Jesus, they refer to them as thieves, as robbers. This is the same word that Jesus used in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Remember, the Good Samaritan was beat up by thieves and then left for dead. This particular word for a thief carries with it the idea of violence. It literally means to rob in the open, to rob out in the open. And these are people who victimize the helpless. They go out and they don't care about anybody else but themselves, and they're not scared of using violence to get what they want and to victimize other people. These are bad people. We would think of them today, this would be a carjacker or somebody like that uses violence and takes vulnerable people and victimizes them. These are bad people. They're not just so-so people. They are criminals worthy of being crucified. And let's look at this conversation here. One of the criminals starts hassling Jesus. Well, if you're who you say you are, save yourself and save us. But the thief on the cross that we like to think about, he stops him and says, hey, we're getting what we deserve. Jesus has done nothing to deserve what we're getting. And then he makes this request of Jesus. I want you to think about this passage. Number one, he knows right from wrong. He's been raised right. He knows that what he's been doing is wrong. He was doing it anyhow, but he knew right from wrong. Number two, he knew who Jesus was. He says, this guy doesn't deserve what he's getting. We do. So he knew enough about Jesus to know that Jesus was an innocent man. So he knew right from wrong. He knew who Jesus was. And thirdly, he knew what Jesus taught, and he understood it. He understood the kingdom better than some of the apostles did. Because even at the very last hour, some of the apostles were confused when Jesus was talking about the kingdom. Go to Acts chapter 1, they're still confused about the kingdom. But this guy understood Jesus' teachings about the kingdom. He understood it enough to say, can I be with you when you come into your kingdom? He knew right from wrong. He knew who Jesus was. He knew what Jesus taught, and he understood it. And he was still a bad man in spite of it. He was still a criminal in spite of it. It ought to have made a difference, but it didn't. And that scares me. Because I know right from wrong. My parents raised me right. I know who Jesus is. I know what Jesus taught. And I think I understand what Jesus taught. And yet there's still things within me that aren't right. That's those tendencies where it ought to make a difference, and it doesn't. And that takes us to the core of what Christian education is supposed to be all about. It comes down to Christ's likeness. And that's what we talked about in Sunday school this morning. To be like Christ. In other words, there needs to be behavioral change. It ought to make a difference. And our goal then is that we are the living example of Jesus Christ today. That is the goal. That's what we're supposed to be about. Listen to some of these passages. Romans 8:28. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined. God's plan was that our destiny was to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. The destiny that God has designed for us is to be like his Son. 1 Corinthians 15:49, that fabulous passage about the resurrection. It says, as we have borne the image of the man of dust, Adam, we'll all die, okay, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly man. That's what it's all about, is that ultimately we bear the image of Christ. Galatians 2:20. Oh, wouldn't it be marvelous to be able to quote this passage and apply it to ourselves with confidence? This is one of those passages that back when I was a youth minister, we used to sing this passage. Boy, it's a hard passage for me to sing today as I begin to understand it more and more. I have been crucified with Christ, Paul said. It's no longer I who lives, but Christ who lives in me. The life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me. I'm crucified. I'm dead. It's Jesus that's living in me. That is the goal of Christian education, is to have Jesus living inside of us. And so in Luke 6:40, a disciple, a student, is not above his teacher, but everyone who's perfectly trained will be like his teacher. And that's axiomatic, whether the teacher's worthy of emulation or not. It is a principle, is a fact of life that students will become like their teacher. That's what you were saying this morning in class. You know, this child walks the same way that the parent walks. Aesop had a marvelous little fable. You remember Aesop's fable? Had a fable about the mother crab that was complaining to her daughter, saying, "You can't walk straight." And finally, the daughter crab says to the mother crab, says, "Well, show me, Mom, how to walk straight." And in disgusted, they just go waddling off down the beach together. Okay, a student's not above his teacher, but everyone who's perfectly trained, fully trained, will be like his teacher. And so this is accomplished through that process of likeness education. Ephesians 4. We talk about this passage in terms of the church. And he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints for the work of ministry. God's equipped the church for ministry, for edifying the body of Christ, till we come to the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of fullness of Christ. Okay. Why do we have preachers? Why do we have elders and deacons and teachers? Why are those people in the church? For the purpose that we all will grow to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Particularly for elders. In 1 Peter 5, Peter's talking to elders, and he says, "Shepherd the flock of God, which is among you, serving as overseers, not by compulsion, but willingly, not for dishonest gain, but equally, not as being lords over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive a crown of glory that does not fade away." There is, in this life, there's nothing more important, no position more important than being an elder. It's such a tremendous responsibility, and it's a responsibility that comes down to example. The elders among all of us are the ones who are manifesting the likeness of Christ and showing that example in front of us. I love this passage from Philippians chapter 4. He's writing to the Philippians. Paul spent a short time living with the people in Philippi, with the church in Philippi. And as he's finishing this love letter, it's a letter of joy to them. He says, "The things which you learned and received and heard and saw in me, these do, and the God of peace will be with you." Ooh, how comfortable do I feel saying to my students, "Hey, the things you've heard me say, the same things that you've seen me do, go ahead. If you do that, then you will have a life of peace." There's times that I can't say that I could look at my 4 daughters and say, "Hey, everything you've seen from me, you do exactly those things and you'll have a life of peace." But Paul was able to say that to the Philippians. And so a student is not above his teacher, but everyone who's fully trained will be like his teacher. And so likeness education is accomplished through a process of replication. We we have leaders who then replicate themselves to others. How about this passage from 2 Timothy chapter 2? The Apostle Paul is in a Roman dungeon. He's waiting to be executed. This is the last letter that we have that he wrote. He's writing to Timothy, and he says, "And the things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach others also." The Apostle Paul invested his life into Timothy and said, just do what I did with you. Do that with other people, that process of replication. And so the end goal of this whole process then is, a lifestyle education. It ought to make a difference. And if it's not making a difference, we're doing something wrong. And we've got to remind ourselves that that's the purpose of what we're doing. As the years have gone by, I've become far more convinced that God is much more concerned about my moral purity than he is my intellectual understanding. I can have all the right answers. I can fill in all the blanks on that Bible test. But is the lifestyle there? One of the things we've said in education all along, that if there's no learning, there hasn't been any teaching. And that's what I want folks to understand in terms of Christian education, whether it's in your home, whether it's in this church, whether it's in a school like ETCA. If there's no learning going on, then there hasn't really been any teaching. And that learning has to be evidenced by a change in behavior, by a change in lifestyle. There's a really interesting passage that I want to illustrate this with in the book of Titus. In Titus chapter 2, the Apostle Paul, in verse 1 of chapter 2, he says, "But as for you, speak the things which are proper to sound doctrine." And then the last verse of chapter 2, he says, "Speak or teach these things." The NIV translates, "These are the things you ought to teach." And so in verse 1 of chapter 2, he says, "Teach these things with sound doctrine." In verse 15, he says, "And these are the things you ought to teach." So, let's look at what's in between verse 1 and verse 15, and that will give us an idea of what it is that we're supposed to be teaching. Well, in verse 2, he starts out, he talks to the older men. The older men teach them to be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, sound in love, sound in patience. Lifestyle, character, behavior. And then, so he starts out with the older men, and then he goes to the older women. The older women likewise, that they be reverent in behavior, not slanderers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things. So he talked to the older men, older women, and then in verses 4 and 5, the older women are supposed to teach the younger women. Well, what are they supposed to teach them? They're to admonish the younger women to be, it literally means lovers of husbands and lovers of children. And it uses the word for friendship love, that affectionate love. Teach the younger women to be affectionate with their husbands and affectionate with their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers. That word for homemakers is a really neat word. In Greek, it takes the word for home and it takes the word for builder and puts them together. They're to be home builders. It's the ladies who build the home. Good, obedient to their husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed. So he talks to older men, older women. The older women teach the younger women. Well, what's next? Well, the younger men. Likewise, exhort the younger men to be sober-minded. The word sober-minded, probably a better way for us to translate that today would be to be self-controlled. Now, that doesn't sound quite fair. The older men, he gives a list. The older women, he gives a list. The younger women get a list. But the younger men, they just have to be self-controlled. If you've ever taught junior high boys during vacation Bible school, let's face it, if you can just get them to be self-controlled, that's the best you can hope for, right? If we can just get them to grow up a little bit, then we'll work on all those other things like temperance and patience. We'll work on that when they're older. But right now, we just want them to be self-controlled. Well, how's this done, Titus? In verses 7 and 8, in all things showing yourself to be a pattern of good works, in doctrine showing integrity, reverence, incorruptibility, sound speech that cannot be condemned, that one who is an opponent may be ashamed, having nothing evil to say to you. Okay, so how is this done? Titus, it's done by you being that example, by you showing them what it means to be temperate, what it means to be patient, what it means to be self-controlled. You show them what that looks like. And then in verses 9 and 10, he says, exhort the bondservants. And the bondservants, these were the household servants. This would be much more akin to employees today in our culture. It's not slaves in the sense of pure ownership, but it's more of an employee relationship. But he said, exhort bondservants to be obedient to their own masters, to be well-pleasing in all things, not answering back, not pilfering, but showing good fidelity, that they may adorn the doctrine of God, our Savior, in all things. Adorn the doctrine of God. That was actually a jeweler's term, and it was the idea of the setting that a jewel is placed in. And the purpose of that setting is to make the jewel even more radiant, to make the jewel even more beautiful because of the setting that it's in. And what Paul is saying to Titus is we are the setting for the jewel of God's doctrine. We are what makes God's doctrine look attractive. It's set within our lives, and that's what makes it so attractive to others. That's what our lives are supposed to be about. It's lifestyle education that makes a difference, and it's teaching us to be like Christ by that example and being replicated. Ephesians chapter 2, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared before that we should walk in them. Why are we here? I teach a senior seminar. We've got 17 seniors I've got in class each day. And just the other day, this was one of the passages I was talking to them about. Right now we're actually doing going through a 7 habits of highly effective people. And but in the process of going through that, well, what does it mean to be successful? And this knowing your purpose, why are you here? Well, our purpose is to do good works. That's why we're here. Luke tells us that Jesus went around doing good. Well, that's what we're supposed to be about. We're here to do good works. And he says, you are God's workmanship. And that's an artistic term. The Greeks would use that of an artist referring to his magnum opus. This is the one thing that he's done in his work that shows his creativity as an artist. Of all of God's creation, we are his workmanship. Okay, we can look in the mirror in the morning and kind of question that, okay? But who we are, the lives we live, God intends for us to be his magnum opus. We are his workmanship. In all of his creative wonder, that's who we are. Ezra, I think, really put this right. He puts out a challenge for us. In Ezra 7:10, it says that Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord and to practice it and to teach his statutes and ordinances to Israel. Ezra got it right. He got it in the right order. He studied, he practiced, and then he taught. It's in that order. This was a picture that was in several different news feeds. It was on ESPN, CBS, Fox News. This was last October 12th, I believe it was. somewhere around the middle of October, Philadelphia Eagles were playing the Carolina Panthers on a Thursday night NFL game. And there was a news feed that didn't stay out there very long because this is not the kind of news that people want to have. It's not the kind of news that the news media wants to portray. But before the game with the Panthers, the Eagles were at the hotel, and before the game, Zach Ertz went into the pool, and with some of the Eagles players around, Zach Ertz baptized wide receiver Marcus Johnson. And Zach Ertz himself has said that he was pretty much a wild guy. He enjoyed the fruits that came with being a star athlete through high school and through college, and was not a very reverent person. Matter of fact, he said that he had no use for religion. Back in August, a wide receiver on the Eagles was traded to the Buffalo Bills. Jordan Matthews was traded from the Eagles to the Bills. And when he was traded, Zach Ertz said that Jordan Matthews showed him what it meant to be a man of God. And on Twitter, he said, "There's no one that's had a greater influence on my life." That was in August. In October, he's baptizing another wide receiver from the Eagles. Jordan was a student at Madison Academy, a Christian school in Huntsville, Alabama, where I worked. Jordan grew up there. Good kid. At the end of his junior year, right at the end of the junior year, his dad made him go on a mission trip to Ghana, West Africa. The president of the school had put the mission trip together. A couple of the high school Bible teachers were also going on the trip, as well as several students. And Jordan's dad made Jordan go with Rod and Justin, his older brother, were going also. Made him go. Jordan didn't want to go on this mission trip. When Jordan came back, Jordan said, "That mission trip has changed my life." He's talked about it many times since. Jordan graduated from us, played football for Vanderbilt, and that was a couple of years ago. That picture there is with my oldest grandson when Jordan was still playing for Vanderbilt. Jordan, a student at a Christian school, being raised by good people, sits in Bible class 5 days out of the week, is in chapel 5 days a week, and then he goes on a mission trip to Africa, and he sees his dad, he sees the school president, he sees his Bible teachers making a difference in the lives of people. And Jordan comes back and he says, "That's changed my life. That makes a difference in my life." And Jordan then shows that difference. And so here's this heathen, Zach Ertz, looking at Jordan's life and says, "He's shown me what it means to be a man of God." And in turn, Zach Ertz now is baptizing his teammates. That's Christian education. It's education that's making the difference in the lives of the students, who in turn then become more like Jesus and then make a difference in the lives of others. Lawrence Richardson says that Christian education is concerned with the progressive transformation of the believer toward the character, values, motives, attitudes, and understanding of God himself. And then he went on to say, much of education is concerned with helping people to know what their teachers know. That's what most education's about, helping students to know what their teachers know. But Christian education is concerned with helping people become what their teachers are. A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone who's fully trained will be like his teacher. Another author has said, the means of achieving godliness is the imitation of God. Isn't that interesting? What we really want is we want to be like God. What was it that Satan tempted Eve with all the way back in the garden? He said, if you eat this, you'll be like God. See, what Satan does is he takes what's natural and he perverts it. And so what we want is we want to be like God. The imitation of God by the student depends upon and conforms to the image of God by the teacher. What the student knows of God is often what he sees in his teacher. When I was growing up in Lima, Ohio, we used Sacred Selections. Did anybody else grow up with the Sacred Selections hymnal? Okay. But in Sacred Selections, hymn number 63 was a hymn that we sang quite a bit growing up. It was called The World's Bible. Does anybody here know this particular hymn? Okay. I think it was just something there in West Ohio that we were big on. Listen to the words of this hymn. Christ has no hands but our hands to do his work today. He has no feet but our feet to lead men in his way. He has no tongue but our tongue to tell men how he died. He has no help but our help to bring them to his side. You see, we're the world's Bible. We're, in verse 2, we're the only Bible the careless world will read. We are the sinner's gospel. We are the scoffer's creed. We are the Lord's last message given in deed and word. What if the type is crooked? What if the print is blurred? What if our hands are busy with other work than his? What if our feet are walking where sin's allurement is? What if our tongues are speaking of things his lips would spurn? How can we hope to help him and hasten his return? We are the world's Bible. What the world knows about Christ is what they're going to see in our lives. A century ago, Teddy Roosevelt made the observation that to educate in mind and not in soul is to educate a menace for society. And I believe our society is reaping the results of that today because folks are not concerned about what's at the heart of Christian education, and that is for us to be like Christ. Philippians chapter 2 really sums this up well. Many scholars believe that Philippians chapter 2 was a very, very early Christian hymn sung by believers in the first century. And this is how that hymn went. It says, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. I'm supposed to have the mind of Christ. I'm supposed to think the way Jesus thinks. Who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. God sent his Son. His Son became like us so that we could know how to become like him. One last passage that I want to share with you. 1 Peter chapter 3. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongly. For what credit is you when you are beaten for your faults? You take it patiently. But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, it is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. A couple of years ago, I had a student by the name of Wyatt. Wyatt was a middle schooler, and Wyatt was having some problems with a teacher that he felt was being a bit unfair. And so I was talking with Wyatt, and we went to 1 Peter chapter 3. And I said, now Wyatt, let's talk about this a little bit. And so we talked about it. He was not really in much of a mood to listen. And so I said, well, tell you what, Wyatt, what I want you to do is, here's a piece of paper, here's a pencil. I want you to write down this passage. Just write it down in your own handwriting, word for word. And then I want you to write me a short paragraph of how this passage could address your situation. And so I got back to work, and he was sitting at the table in my office and looked over, and he was just sitting there. And I said, Wyatt, I gave you a job to do it. He looked at me, he said, I can't do it. I said, what do you mean you can't do it? I said, just take your pencil and write. I mean, what's so hard about that? He says, no, I can't do it. I said, what do you mean you can't do it? He said, that's too hard to do what Jesus did. It's hard to do what Jesus did. It's hard to have the character of Christ. It's a tough road. It's a road of suffering. It's a road of sacrifice. But it's the road that we're supposed to be traveling. Last year, I had one of the greatest experiences of my entire life. The first week of February, I met a gentleman by the name of Pan Lu. He was a visiting professor from Shanghai. Shanghai is the way he pronounced it. He's a software professor at a university in Shanghai, and he was a visiting professor in the United States for 10 months. And as students come from overseas, they have to pass English competency tests and that sort of thing. So foreign students coming to the United States to study, their English is usually pretty good, but they don't have that kind of requirements for a visiting professor. And so Pan's English was really pretty poor. But a friend from church had started working at a university on one night a week, offering some English classes as part of a program called FriendSpeak. And we used workbooks using the Gospel of Luke, starting with the Gospel of Luke, doing English lessons. And so he just put a notice on the bulletin board in the student union, free English lessons. And so foreign students would come, and then we would use scripture to teach. And so Pan showed up, and we were paired together, and Pan and I became very, very good friends. Pan literally knew nothing about Jesus Christ. He had never spoken to a Christian. He knew absolutely nothing about Christianity. And a couple of weeks into it, in Luke chapter 2, there's a passage where the word Christ is. And our typical routine was that I would read through a passage first, so you could hear the pronunciation, inflection, that sort of thing. And then he would read through it, and I'd say, okay, now are there any words in this section here that you don't know? And so we went through this passage, and we did that, and I said, are there any words you don't know? And he pointed to the word Christ. And I said, this word right here. He kind of tilted his head. He said, Christian? And I said, well, that's where the word Christian comes from. And at that moment, I realized that Pan had never heard the name of Christ in his entire life. 45-year-old college professor from Shanghai, China, and he had never heard the name of Christ. And so I'm praying silently as I'm talking, saying, God, please let me, since this is the first time, let me say what you want me to say, what this word means, what this title means, who this Jesus, the Christ, is. And Pan was absolutely excited. He was fascinated by the stories of Jesus. He was completely overwhelmed. They were completely brand new to him. One night we were studying together, and I was talking about how Jesus was making enemies, and I said, well, that's why they went ahead and murdered him. He said, they murdered him? It was so refreshing. And when we started studying the book of Acts and we got to baptism, I asked him what he thought about baptism. And he said, oh, I don't know. He said, if I get baptized, I may lose my job. In China, government only want us to believe in socialism. He said, I believe in God, though. I believe God has sent me to America. I believe God has made us friends. But I don't want to lose my job. He flew back to, his wife knew no English at all. And so several months into this, I asked him, I said, well, Pan, what does your wife think about your interest in Christianity? And he said, oh, she likes it. I said, really? He said, yeah, because she says that I'm a better person. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I don't get angry as much anymore. See, he was getting it. He had a difference in his life. And Pan and his wife and their little daughter flew back to China on Thanksgiving Day last year. But the Saturday before, we had a get-together, and he came up as I went to his house to pick him up. As I was picking him up, he said, can I be baptized tonight? And we baptized him before he went back to China. One of the most thrilling experiences of my entire life. But Pan was getting it. It's a difference. It makes a difference in the way we live. You see, Jesus left us an example. That word there for example in 1 Peter 2 is a very interesting word. It's the only time this particular word for example is used in the New Testament. And it's the Greek word, and I don't usually like to throw around Greek words, but it has a purpose here. It's hypogramma. It comes from the word hypo, which means under, and gramma, which comes from graphic. It means to write under. Okay, to write under. Well, what does that mean? Well, in Greek, the teachers would oftentimes use an example sentence written by the teacher for the students to learn how to form their letters. Oftentimes, they were just nonsensical statements that would have all the letters of the alphabet in them. And the students back in ancient Greece, when they were learning to write, they used wax tablets, and the wax trays, and it would have a thin coat of wax. And then the student would have a stylus that was pointed on one end, flat on the other end. And so they would make their markings in the wax, and then they'd take the flat end, smooth it all out again, and then use it all over because paper, vellum, that sort of thing was just too rare for a child to practice their letters on. And so the teacher then would give the students an example sentence for them to write. But the Greeks said the good teachers, though, not only gave them that example sentence, the good teachers would take the student's own tray and the student's own stylus, and they would form those letters in the wax themselves, and then instruct the students to follow the grooves of the wax to learn how to make those letters. He said, but the really good teachers, those were the teachers who would place the student's hand on top of their hand as they made that example sentence so the student could get the feel of how those letters were made. Jesus left that example for us. That's the example. He came here and he left that example for us. The question for us is it making a difference? We know right from wrong. We know who Jesus is. We even know what he taught and understood it. It ought to make a difference, is it? And the whole question is, whose hand is in your hand? With that in mind, let's stand and sing.
Let us rise up and build in the name of